I think psychiatric diagnosis has the potential to rob people of a sense of agency. That they are told that they have this condition, they're victims of this condition, and they need some external fix. It doesn't have to be drugs, it might be psychotherapy, it might be something else. And this is a problem because in almost every area, I don't think there's a controversy here, we actually want to pull on people's agency.
Welcome to the Social Exchange. Today I spoke with Dr. Sandy Steingard. Dr. Steingard is Chief Medical Officer at Howard Center in Vermont and author of the book Critical Psychiatry. She's also a blogger for Mad in America, an online magazine founded by Robert Whitaker, a previous guest. Today, Sandy and I have a fascinating, critical conversation about American psychiatry. We talked about the marketing of psychiatric drugs, the consequences of widespread prescribing of these drugs, problems with our current system of categorization of mental illnesses, and Dr. Steingard offers some practical solutions, ways that we might address the problems that psychiatry faces currently, and approaches that may improve health outcomes. While Sandy's discussing all of these things, it's with a great deal of humility. Although she is being critical about her own field, not for an instant does she claim to have superior knowledge about any of the things that she's discussing. And I don't mean that she says these things in some sort of a superficial way or acts honest when maybe she's not. She is honest. She was honest in this interview in a way that I don't think a person can really fake honesty. It was an eye-opening experience and an incredible pleasure to speak with her. And now I'm going to pay that gift forward. This is Dr. Sandy Steingard. Sandy Steingard, thank you so much for doing this in person with me.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
So I got to know you because I attended a training at the Howard Center where you're the chief medical officer, and I was taken aback by how lucid and how common sense and how intelligent your speech was. I was sort of waiting for the areas in which I might disagree with you, but you were so cogent. Everything you were saying made so much sense to me. Would you, just before we launch into what that talk was all about and why I'm so interested in you, just give a little bit about your background and how you became involved in the Howard Center.
So I'm the Chief Medical Officer of Howard Center, which is a fairly large community mental health center based in Burlington, Vermont. I've been at the agency for 24 years. My area of clinical interest has been working with people who have what we call psychotic conditions. Their diagnosis might be schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, and that's been an area of interest of mine for many, many years. So I work with them, work with people who try to support them. Our mission is to help people live meaningful lives and to be able to be successful living in the community. Over years, I've moved from doing that almost exclusively to also being involved in a broader way in the administration of the agency, which is a large agency. We serve children, we serve people with developmental disabilities, we have a large substance abuse program, and so I'm more peripherally involved with all of those things. So that's been my career, essentially.
So back to this talk that you gave and that I attended, you said in your talk that somewhere around 2011, you read the work of Robert Whitaker, namely Anatomy of an Epidemic. And that changed your framing, at least started to budge your thinking about what psychiatry is and how best to help the people that you work with on a regular basis. Is that a fair framing? And will you talk about what changed for you?
Yeah, but if it's okay, I'm going to back up a little bit because in some ways I think I was well along the path to my current identity as a critical psychiatrist, but I didn't have that language at the time. So I started in psychiatry a long time ago in early 1980s with the intent to be a psychoanalyst. That's why I became a psychiatrist. And I would say my first kind of encounter with a critical stance was when I kind of literally fell off the couch. And I initially really felt that there was a lot of profound insight in that way of thinking about people. And over time, I became disappointed. I thought it had a problem with quality control, which I can talk a lot more, but I questioned it in a fundamental way and needed to move away from that. So then I needed to figure out what to do with this training that I had just completed over many years. And in my training as a resident in psychiatry, I was just very interested in the phenomenon of psychosis and decided that those are people that I don't think are often well served. Even within psychiatry, it's not a glamour area. People tend to focus more on other kinds of problems. And I felt this connection that I can't really explain, but has never really left me. But that sort of positioned me more in what people would call kind of the biomedical frame. I thought of schizophrenia is fundamentally a problem of the brain. My role was to offer medications, although I've always worked in a place where there were other people around because there were other things that people needed, housing and food and social supports and all that kind of stuff. So I've always wanted to work as a part of a team. But that brought me to Vermont, and in the 90s, a lot of new medications came onto the market, and like many other people, I was very excited. The drugs that we had, the drugs that were introduced in the 50s and 60s, were not good drugs. They had a lot of problems, and there was this big promise that these new drugs would be better. And what I witnessed was what I think was a co-opting of the medical establishment, the academic and guild establishment by the pharmaceutical industry. And what I witnessed directly was incredible promotion of these drugs. The promotion did not match what the studies at the time showed. They were not more effective. They may have had fewer side effects in some areas, but more side effects in other areas. And I think it wasn't acknowledged. And I saw how leaders in my field were working essentially for the pharmaceutical industry to promote this. And this was extremely disturbing to me. And I started reading a lot in that area. I'd say starting around 1999. In 2000, books came out from academics. Marcia Angel, who was the first female editor of the New England Journal of Medicine. This is one of the premier academic medical journals in the world, wrote a lot about this. And then there were some journalists. And that was a big push in trying to talk about that, at least locally. And somehow I think through what I was reading, I don't know how I found out about anatomy of an epidemic, but I think the internet presented it to me in some way.
They knew what you were paying attention to.
Yeah, how these things go, where you search and all that. And I read it, and the thing that Robert Whitaker writes about in that book that wasn't part of what I was thinking about wasn't just that these drugs might be over-promoted, or certainly with like the SSRI antidepressants not nearly as effective as people thought they were, which I was already pretty familiar with. He raises a question with all the classes of drugs, but the chapter that really pulled me in was the antipsychotic drugs, is that they might worsen long-term outcome. Now, that's a profound possibility for someone like me who had basically been spending my career trying to convince people to stay on these drugs. Now, I had been influenced early on about conservative use of the drugs. And again, I was worried about their over-promotion and people using them too much and higher doses. But this was a different issue, which was that the people that were on the drugs indefinitely might have worse outcomes than people that maybe took them intermittently or tried to get off of them. So I had a choice at that point. That was his hypothesis, and he presented a lot of evidence to support that hypothesis. He's not a psychiatrist, he's not a clinician, he's a journalist, and I had a choice to say either he must be wrong, he doesn't know what he's talking about, or to say maybe he's right. I didn't feel I could take it as gospel. So that led me to this deep dive and kind of a deconstruction of everything that I thought. And through that, I ended up, it's just kind of kept expanding and expanding in terms of who I was reading, who I was talking to. I began writing on his website, and that brought me in touch with a lot of other people. And then that's really expanded to beyond just the question of how to use the drugs, which remains a very core interest of mine, but to like re-examining what we mean when we talk about, well, psychosis or any mental disorder. What's the best way to conceptualize it? What's the best way to explain it to people? And fundamentally is this medical conceptualization, which is, what I had been living with. Is that always the best thing? Or, I could go on. There's a lot of different aspects to this. And that's, I think, what I was addressing in that talk about not holding as a psychiatrist what philosophers call the epistemic authority, to say, I know what this is, and my job is to tell you how to think about it and tell you what the treatment is to really step back and to be able to be open to multiple ways of understanding it.
So maybe it's not that Robert Whitaker, who we'll talk about later, gave you the epiphany. You had had this feeling sort of bubbling up for quite some time and perhaps weren't able to put language to it. And reading this work in 2010, 2011 gave you the language to be able to express what had been bubbling up for quite some time.
Well, I mean, the thing that was bubbling inside is that I think that that these drugs were being overly promoted, and there was a distortion about them. There was a distortion about how effective they were. There was a distortion about their relative safety, and that was of concern. And I was seeing, let me just go back for a minute. When I started out early on in my career, I was at the University of Pittsburgh, and I participated in a study that really left a big mark on me. It was a well-done study, and it was testing this hypothesis that very low doses of antipsychotic drugs were as effective as much higher doses that were in common use at the time. And it was a study of haloperidol, which is one of the older antipsychotic drugs. And they can cause stiffness, tremor. They have a lot of nasty side effects. And the hypothesis is that if you give a person a dose that causes almost imperceptible neurologic side effects, that is going to be as effective as a dose that's much higher. And so I worked with a psychiatrist, Joe McAvoy. He was the lead investigator, and he did a pretty rigorous study, fairly large number of people, and I think got convincing evidence that these low doses that would have been unheard of at the time were as effective. Now that left a big mark on me, and what happened is that shortly after that study came out, the first of the new wave of antipsychotics came out. Risperidone was the first one. It was called Risperdal. And what happened is that this caution, which is really where the field was at the time, we need to be careful with these drugs. They have some serious side effects. And the leading academic psychiatrists in schizophrenia, psychopharmacology, were saying, be careful, be careful. And what I witnessed was a complete abandonment of that principle. And it was by the same people, in my opinion, who were giving this other narrative. And that was disturbing to me because we learned that these drugs had newer bad side effects. And it was obvious to me, that was another thing, that this drug olanzapine called Zyprexa came out in around 1996. And that was right after I'd come to Howard Center. I was extremely enthused about this drug. In fact, I gave one drug talk for the pharmaceutical company, and it was about it, and it left me feeling a little bit dirty because they gave me the slides and I delivered it and it didn't feel right, never did it again. But I knew in a year that drug caused significant weight gain. You would see people gain 20, 30 pounds, and you don't even need to be looking for it. You can see that just by noticing, a person's body change. And then I watched the leaders of my field, the academic leaders of my field, argue over this, and the ones who were getting money from one drug company would argue one way and the others would argue another way, until finally people admitted that this was the case, and now we have this rampant problem of obesity and all the health concerns that are associated with it among our patients on these drugs. So I was pretty angry about this. One of the first things I did when I became medical director at Howard was to ban pharmaceutical representatives from coming in. They used to come in and leave presents. They would invite me to these dinners where you can go pick up Chinese food and then talk with a drug rep. We know now that this influences what people do. And I was angry. I'm still really, really disappointed in my profession and the leaders for not acknowledging this. So yes, I went into reading Anatomy of an Epidemic angry about this. And one could argue that that's my bias, that maybe I was more prone to look negatively at my profession. And fair enough. And one of the reasons why I started blogging was to engage other colleagues. Because if I was wrong, it would be embarrassing to be wrong in a public way, but I think my motives were sincere. If I was missing something, people claimed Robert Whitaker was cherry picking. If he was cherry picking, I wanted my smarter and more knowledgeable colleagues to tell me what he missed, what he was ignoring. And I've not seen it yet. I really haven't.
Blogging about this allows you to think critically, sort of out loud, among people who may or may not agree, but at least they're asking the same questions.
Well, what happened is I read the book, and I've never done this before, but I decided to email him. And the first email was, "Dear Mr. Whitaker, I just read your book. It was very interesting. Thank you very much." And he got back to me, to my surprise. And I said, do you mind if I ask you a few questions? Because there were certain things that he brought up. I mean, this gets sort of technical, and I was still struggling with. And what was remarkable to me is that he engaged me very deeply in this. He knows the literature, and so we went back and forth. And then he was invited to speak at Dartmouth, and they wanted to have a psychiatrist on the panel. And as he tells it, I mean, I don't know if this is true, they couldn't get anyone in that department to talk. And so he said, well, I've been corresponding with the psychiatrist in Burlington. That's not so far from Lebanon. And so they invited me down, and that talk, a friend of mine helped me get it published in one of those psychiatric newspapers. And then when he started his webzine, he said, "What do you think about writing?" And I had all these ideas filling me up, and I was working on this stuff, and I thought, sure, I'll do that. But it was my way of working through it. If you look at my blogs, I work through in my own way what I think about the antipsychotic drugs, and it was a public working through of this. And the idea was, tell me where I'm wrong. And that's kind of gone from there. And it's, as I said, has brought me in contact with a lot of people. I'd say the group of people that have really had a major influence is me on the people with lived experience. There is a lot of really smart, thoughtful people out there that some of whom have gone on to get advanced degrees, some have gone other training, and I've been introduced to that world in a way that I hadn't been before, and they've had an enormous impact on me.
You're describing the way you think through these problems, and I think it's the way that a lot of people say that they think through problems, whether or not it's true. But I know with a degree of moral certainty it's true about you. When you and I first spoke, you were talking about trying to make sense of or wrap your mind around Robert Whitaker's book, and you were saying, I read it, and it's certainly not comfortable, but he had a strong understanding of facets of psychiatry that you knew to be true, so you didn't have any reason to think on that basis that the rest of the book would be any more false than the beginning of the book. So you sort of work through it that way, kind of piecemeal, if I could say that. And I think I'm thinking through it kind of the same way now, and I'm living vicariously through you, and I want to ask, when you talk about some drugs being marketed as perhaps being more helpful than they really are, and even the fact that drugs could be doing harm, how much of that harm do you think comes from the drug itself, and how much of the harm would you say really comes from psychiatrists taking their eye off of what could be better, more common sense approaches in favor of drugs?
Boy, I'm not sure how to parse that, because I don't know where the line is between a drug doing harm and a psychiatrist not paying attention. I don't know whether you want to elaborate on that question. I mean, you could say, I'll give a personal example. I've had some inflammatory joint problems, and I was put on a drug called methotrexate, and it seemed to help, but then I got a very low white blood cell count, and I needed to stop it. Now, I don't fault the rheumatologist. I was informed of that, and she recommended that I get my white count checked periodically, and plus I knew if I had a sore throat or something like that, I should check my white count. So if, for instance, she never informed me of that risk or never checked a white count, I might not be alive right now because it got really low. So, is that what you're saying is the problem? Would it be like, well, methotrexate is a problem because in a certain portion of people it can cause low white blood cell counts? Or is the problem doctors who don't pay attention to that? I mean, is that the distinction?
Yeah. No, I think that's a really great question. So let me rethink for a second about how I should ask this.
Yeah.
I mean, if I'm being reflective, I guess what you were just saying is that any drug has its given benefits and its given harms, and it's difficult in some cases to be able to tell which drug is going to harm which patient. On the other hand, there are drugs that we know do harm pretty much across the board. And not only are we not trying to avoid prescribing these drugs, but we're doubling down on them. And oftentimes we're doubling down on them as though there is no other more practical way to engage in psychiatry, when maybe there really is. Am I right there? Is that what you're saying?
So can you give me because I have a feeling you have something in mind.
Well, no, I can get specific. I mean, let's say antidepressants. It's a class of drugs people talk about a lot, and it's something I think about a lot, and something that Marsha Angel, who you were talking about earlier, writes about. I'm just always thinking about, if I were a psychiatrist, and I'm not, it's certainly above my pay grade or level of analysis, but if I were, how would I even balance that cost-benefit scenario for a given patient? You know, I'm curious if there's a difference between the way the old you may have thought about this and the new you as a critical psychiatrist thinks about this.
Well, I hope it's okay. What I'd like to introduce is a concept that's been enormously helpful for me to think about what I do, because, you know, the day I put down anatomy, I wasn't sure I could go to work the next day. I mean, that's how profound it was for me. And that's why I just felt compelled to make sense of it. I mean, I knew some people who read it, were angry, and just tossed it aside, didn't think there was anything there. I don't fault them. It just wasn't how it hit me. Yeah. For the reasons that you articulated. There were certain things I thought he got right, and so I wasn't comfortable just ignoring the things that were new to me. But I hit one person that's had a big influence on me is a British psychiatrist, Joanna Moncrief. And she's written a lot about somewhat similar topics from the perspective of a psychiatrist. And she has conceptualized two kinds of approaches to pharmacotherapy. And one, what she calls a disease-centered approach, the other, a drug-centered approach. Mm-hmm. And she would argue that what's become the prominent conceptualization is a disease-centered approach. And that says these are drugs that treat a disease or disorder. That there's a problem that the drug fixes. Okay? And so when in the 90s, at the height of the SSRIs, there was a commercial on TV for the SSRI is an antidepressant selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. And one of the drugs being promoted at the time is sertraline, was marketed as Zoloft. And there would be this little ball of serotonin. And so selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor means that in the space between the nerve cells, to communicate, a nerve cell releases a chemical, they're called neurotransmitters. It gets taken up by the next nerve cell, and that's how they talk. And when this action is done, the neurotransmitter gets retaken up in the first nerve cell. It's basically like that. And what these SSRIs do is block the reuptake, taking up of serotonin. And so the idea became that depression must have to do with low serotonin, and by blocking its uptake, there's more serotonin. And so there was a commercial on TV where you'd see this little serotonin ball, and I guess there was a lot of them a long time ago. That's a core disease-centered approach, that you are sad because of not having enough serotonin. This drug fixes it. So that does a lot of things to people. It says that the drug is fixing it, so therefore I need to stay on it because the problem's going to come back. And there were some studies done showing what happens when people relapse, showing higher rates of recurrence of symptoms when the drug is stopped. And I can go into the problems with those drugs. Now, so that's a disease-centered approach. Now, a drug-centered approach says that these are fundamentally psychoactive substances. So in that way, it doesn't really distinguish between, let's say, the drugs I prescribe and other psychoactive substances, alcohol, cannabis, other things on the street that people take, that These are drugs that fundamentally alter the brain in such way as to sort of alter sort of mood or perception or other things. So it's a brain-based model, but that these effects are superimposed on whatever the problem is. And so like the SSRIs are working on the serotonin system. They may do other things, and some of them we know do other things. It's that imposition of a state that some people may find helpful and some people may not. So as you may recall, when I give this talk, I will talk about myself as a kind of nerdy person, and I'm not great in social settings. And there have been times when I'll go to sort of a cocktail party and feel uncomfortable, and I might have a little bit of alcohol. I'm not a big drinker, so I'm very susceptible to the effects. And I will experience the effects that everyone experiences, a little bit of disinhibition, a little bit of euphoria in the short term, and that effect will make this experience much more palatable to me. So you could say that from a disease-centered approach, you could say I have cocktail party deficit disorder, right, and the alcohol is treating the disorder. Mm-hmm. Or you could say I have a brain, my brain responds to alcohol the way that most do. And that superimposition of effect, for whatever reason I'm such a socially awkward person, helps me to get through the event. That's, to me, a good illustration. And you can have that conversation with every class of drugs. So that really, and with antipsychotics, that was a little bit of a leap for me. It took me a lot of time of reading, going back to the literature. What does the drug do to people who aren't psychotic? That's how you understand drug-centered effects and to reconsider what I do. And that changes the way I talk about these drugs with people. And I would argue it would change the kinds of questions we're asking, the way we study them, the way we think about withdrawal, which I think has been understudied in our field. So really, that has, I don't know that I've actually answered your question, but for me, that's such an important way that I've changed in how I think about what I'm doing as a psychiatrist. Now I talk to people that thought I would bring that up here.
No, I think you made the question better. So there are objective truths about what a drug physically does or doesn't do to a person and their body. And then there are some basic categories of good and bad, we can say, or benefit and harms that we could say the drugs are doing to somebody. More importantly, though, are the stories that we're telling about not just the drugs and what they do, but a person's life and what makes them worthy of being called disordered. You know, there are probably some cases in which a person is just responding to the world around them, like you at a cocktail party. If you're feeling nervous and alcohol helps you, could be that somebody is trying to respond to and make sense of the world in a way that looks like what we call depression, and because we have a story around what depression is and that it responds to a drug in an immediate sense, that person is sort of sick and maybe for a certain preordained period of time. I see what you mean. It's like those stories can do a lot more harm than good. The stories themselves, the framing. But one thing I wonder is, because you work with people with psychosis, I suppose psychosis you would calculate that on some sort of a spectrum, and when you're really making the most sense of it, you would be able to talk about psychosis within the context of a person's life and social life and the context around them. But is there an extreme end of psychosis where it's okay to do some categorizing in a way that's actually helpful and not stealing someone's story from them? Like, I imagine you wouldn't want to say you're depressed, that's a biomedical ailment, the medication's the only thing that can save you. And you especially wouldn't want to do that when this person has told you nothing about their lives. So now you've created their prologue for them, and you've created the situation for them. You've created a framing they can't get out of. Is there extreme case of psychosis where you would say, okay, it's best to categorize this person as having some sort of psychosis and working from there? And if that ever is okay to do some theorizing and taking the liberty to do so as a psychiatrist, how do you do that, and how do you frame it in a way that doesn't leave the person trapped in this identity forever?
I think one of the advantages of having done this work for so long is that you see so much variety. And again, one area that we haven't got into that was also part of my critical thinking before reading Robert Whitaker was a critique of our diagnostic system. Yeah. Which is categorical, and many people have written about this, and that's another area that I had been reading about and just had come to from doing the work. And before I started, I was taught about schizophrenia, and as a resident, I would see some people who met the criteria, and I was given like one frame to think about it, that it's a chronic condition, that most people are going to be disabled for the rest of their lives, and core symptoms. And then when you immerse yourself in it, I see the variability, and I had already come to appreciate how highly variable this thing is. And I don't find that label all that helpful. In fact, I think it can be harmful because people know something about it, and whatever they know, it generally isn't good. And to tell a young person this is what you have, I think can do some damage. So that question, is there's a line in the sand, is something that has interested me for a long time. For instance, so I've just talked about the variability even among people that meet criteria for schizophrenia. But even in the DSM, we have categories like delusional disorder, where you have some symptoms of schizophrenia but not others, or schizoaffective disorder, where you have some symptoms of what we call schizophrenia and some symptoms of bipolar disorder, and then bipolar disorder itself, where some people may have psychosis and others don't. So even if you accept the DSM, just by looking at it and thinking about it, it's quite clear that there's quite a variability, and the lines between these categories are blurry. So that's already something that we know and that I observe. But then I became interested in sort of extreme thoughts. Like, what about fanaticism? What about people that are like caught up with an idea that sort of blurs into what a lot of other people think, but maybe they put an idiosyncratic twist on it? I mean, the line between delusion and other thoughts is that you're the only one who thinks it, or it's idiosyncratic in a particular way. I mean, I've just had experiences where people might tell me something that it seems implausible, and because of other things, I'm willing to think about it as a delusion, only to find out that no, this is true. One person that stayed with me is someone who came in and to the hospital, and he had ideas that I don't think were true. He thought that he was being communicated with by airplanes flying overhead, and he would put these placards out, and he lived in one of the rural areas of Vermont. They were kind of offensive to a lot of people around, the nature of them, and those placards he thought were communicating with planes going overhead. He thought that the Social Security check that he was getting because he was on disability was covert payment because he was a CIA operative. And he came in the hospital because he had done a pretty bad thing. He had pretty seriously assaulted someone that he loved. This was a long time ago. I don't want to give more details. And it was interesting because he came into the hospital and he did go on an antipsychotic medication and seemed to improve. And then one day I was leaving the unit and he showed me the book that he was reading, and he was reading a book about the JFK conspiracy. And he was showing me pictures of Howard Hunt, who was part of the Watergate conspiracy. When I was a young person, I was completely caught up in Watergate. I spent my entire summer before going off to college following this intensely. I knew who Howard Hunt was, but this book, there are many, many people out there who believe that there's some conspiracy of different flavors that contributed to John F. Kennedy's assassination. We don't label them all as psychotic, but to me, there's a gradation. And in my mind, this gentleman went from having what I was pretty comfortable calling psychosis and moving into sort of the more broader, comfortable world of conspiracy theorists. So, we see this today in our political world. The same event can happen, and people look at it and come down with completely different ways of thinking about it. And on one side, you look at this other side and say, that can't possibly be true. Now, we don't label that as psychosis. It's a deeply held belief, but on the margins, I think there are some people that cross over into what a psychiatrist might call psychosis. So yeah, I think it blurs into other ways of thinking. And one of the things that I've been exploring is dialogic practice as a way. In the talk, I talked about need-adapted therapies, and there's a lot to it. But one part is to try to give people a language to talk about what their experience is that helps them connect to other people, because some people think this experience of psychosis may be so isolating because here you are in this world that no one else really understands. And if there's a way to bridge it and help a person find a tie into how other people see the world, that may be healing in a way. And that's something that I've been exploring.
We hope you're enjoying the show so far. And hey, if you're enjoying the show in general, if you're a fan of what we're doing, please support us. You can support us in a variety of ways. One is just to share the podcast among friends and social media. Another free way, but slightly greater service to us, is to rate and review us on iTunes or your preferred podcast app. Those ratings go a long way in our searchability, and more people tend to find us when we're getting more ratings. And finally, if it's reasonable to you, you can make a donation at patreon.com/thesocialexchange. That's patreon.com/thesocialexchange, and for as little as $2 a month, you can receive rewards, including early access to all podcast episodes. And of course, there are greater rewards for greater contribution amounts. Find out more at patreon.com/thesocialexchange. And speaking of Patreon, we'd like to thank all of our new patrons: Chris L., Leon Naufahu, Sherry Chandler, Dee Dee Stout, Christopher Hanlon, Henri Pompel, Carter Vermont, Rick Barnett, Ann Earl, Inigo, John, Layla, Mary Kay Villaverde, Michelle, Nancy, Sean, Regina Ferguson, Tammy Tucker, Christian, Thomas, Kathleen Cochran, Marjorie Israel, Diane T., Trevor, Susan Matthew, and Linda Rhodes. Thank you all very much for helping us keep the lights on around here. And again, if you want to join this list and help us create educational content for the public, ad-free, visit patreon.com/thesocialexchange. Now back to our interview with Dr. Sandy Steingard. Yeah, and I feel like it's easy for people to become defined by their diagnosis or by their psychosis, if that's what it is, and become locked into a story about their lives that was imposed on them. You know, everything that you're saying, I am getting this image of Kanye West. He is, I don't think anybody would argue that he's not very idiosyncratic, that he does grandiose, very strange things, that he likely has a delusional sense of the world around him, yet he produces a lot of value. He has a lot of social connections, a lot of resources, a lot of money, some fame. And so it's almost like he gets the choice not to have to be defined by psychosis, because people don't want to put that title on him. And I feel like this implies a sort of awful notion. Certain kinds of people are perhaps coerced, can I say, into their diagnosis, and that other people with the exact same behaviors, they're lauded for them.
I mean, we can get into a conversation about psychiatric coercion. I mean, I'd say it's the most controversial thing in psychiatry. I would say that alone is why there is an anti-psychiatry movement. But so I don't want to dismiss it. I think it's a serious topic, a complicated topic. But what's been interesting for me is to allow people to listen very carefully to how an individual describes the problem before I too quickly go in and almost colonize. I mean, this is from the critical social sciences concept of psychiatrists colonizing a person's experience. So in this work that we're doing, this need-adapted approach, part of it is to start with really listening to how everyone and it's a social network-based way of working, so how everyone in the network, including the person at the center of concern, thinks about the problem. We really hold back on diagnosis, don't really see that as helpful. It sort of flips the way that we, how we currently do things, which is sort of an assessment, evaluation, come up with a diagnosis, and then the diagnosis drives treatment. In this way of working, the beginning thing is to try to get some understanding and to encourage people to talk about it and to include everyone's way of thinking about it. So if a person is saying the problem is the government, or I'm employed by the government, to really listen to that carefully and try to understand where that came from and why. And it's not to say that you need to agree. You may say, I've never had that experience, and how does that work? And to really be kind of curious about it, but also to hear what other people have to say and to be open to talking about the ways that this may be disruptive and why it might be, problematic in your little small town to put some, things that other people find offensive, and to really try to understand it. And in some ways to help people maybe come up with, on their own, and to see whether over time they may have a way of understanding the problem that's more in keeping with consensual reality. It's hard to live in the world when you have, you're an idiosyncratic view of everything. It gets in the way. So the problem isn't to say you have schizophrenia and so you need to take this treatment, but you may talk about what the problem is, how this might be interfering, how this might be causing them problems, and to work with that person to figure out their own solution to this. And it can be enormously helpful. I think it also has some other advantages. A lot of people in the world I work with psychosis don't like my psychiatric way of thinking about it. They feel really alienated. And we have a big problem of people that don't want our help because they feel very alienated by this. And so the hopefulness here is that we try not to alienate people. We try to engage. Engagement is much more important than reaching a quick diagnosis, and to see if you can keep the conversation going. The other thing is that I think psychiatric diagnosis has the potential to rob people of a sense of agency, that they are told that they have this condition, they're victims of this condition, and they need some external fix. It doesn't have to be drugs. It might be psychotherapy. It might be something else. And this is a problem because in almost every area, I don't think there's a controversy here, we actually want to pull on people's agency. Right. Depression, anxiety, psychosis, we want to rally their internal sense of what they can do. It's going to be important if you believe that cognitive behavioral therapy is helpful, if you believe dialectic behavioral therapy is helpful, any of this. And I think we give this message of that you're a passive victim and therefore you're going to be this like receptacle of therapeutic help. And I think that can undermine people's success. And there is some data showing that people who preserve a greater sense of agency tend to do better. Now, maybe we don't have control about that. Maybe that's some kind of temperamental quality, but let's not trample on it. Let's try to make sure that whatever we're doing is rallying agency as opposed to dampening it, because I think that can be helpful.
I'm tempted to just ask you to describe for me what open dialogue therapy is, something that you talked about when I saw you for the first time. Before we get to that, of course you're singing my tune. I think that we should be looking across domains of a person's lifespan and give them a say in looking at different domains across their lifespan before coming to a determination that somebody is sick or unable to do something. But how do the practical parts of what it means to be a psychiatrist come into play here, and how do they jibe or not with this method? Things like insurance, like you have to diagnose somebody, right, in order to bill them so that they can actually access and afford your care. How do you reconcile that?
Well, there's not a simple answer, and I think that in some ways the social service apparatus made a deal with the devil with the development of Medicaid. And people don't think about it enough. So I think one thing is just to sort of be explicit. Medicaid is a medical insurance policy. Now, I work for an agency that is largely Medicaid funded. I'm very grateful for it. My whole career, my salary I'm a Medicaid doctor, so we need it. I mean, we need it because it's a very important source of money. And my interest is in working with people who don't have resources, and to be able to provide them care. But so it's not a critique of people who use Medicaid. It's just talking about what it is. It is a medical insurance policy that has seeped in and influenced not just psychiatry, but I would say social work and psychology and everything. So you see someone and any kind of time that you're billing needs to have a diagnosis. That's a medical thing. These are medical diagnoses. So it's a problem. And what I think is that we've not been alert enough to how that has influence us and what the implications have been for how we work with people. So that's one thing, is just to sort of acknowledge it. But I think the second thing is how you talk about diagnosis. So I do need to put a diagnosis down, but I try to work very hard to say what it is and what it isn't. And so I'm explicit. It's a label. It's a label that goes with sort of a collection of experiences that you have. I'm pretty explicit with people that, this is what it means, this is what it doesn't mean to me. And I also try to be curious about what they think. When I'm meeting with people for the first time, I'm really just listening to what their experiences are and don't come down heavy on this. I may ask them what other people have said, and then we talk about what that means to them. And then I ask them if they're interested in what it means to me. So that's the best I can do right now. I need to put a diagnosis down in the chart. 15 minutes, and you need to put a diagnosis down. And there's sort of like vague, non-specific labels that you can use, but it's a label. And right then and there, you're in the medical model, whether you want to be or not.
That reminds me, I was with a guidance counselor one time, and she was giving a class full of kids, like a faux personality test. She was above board about that. So, like, not only was it not the big five psychometric analysis, but it was like a silly personality test. And she said to people, all right, choose A, B, C, or D. And somebody asked the pointed question, well, what if none of these apply? As if to say, hey, but there's a fluidity in my life experience. And the guidance counselor said, well, just choose the best one that fits. It's not, it doesn't really mean anything. And it sounds like that's what you're trying to do with diagnoses in general. You're saying this diagnosis doesn't necessarily define you, but it's the best we could do to pull terms from the lexicon ahead of time to describe an experience that might be something like yours. So we can ditch this over time, but let's use this as a starting point, right?
But it's tricky. I mean, there's a concept in philosophy that I'm likely going to butcher. My husband is a philosopher and has taught me a lot and exposed me to a lot of ideas. But it's this idea of essentialism, so that there's a thing. So let's say oxygen is a thing that, every oxygen atom is like every other oxygen atom, and it's like this essential thing. Every water molecule is like every other water molecule. So if you say this is water, you've described this essential feature. And I think that some people, there's a psychologist, Pete Zacher, who wrote a really excellent book on, I think it's called The Metapsychology of Diagnosis, but he explores this idea. And I remember in the book, he talks something about how humans seem to be very prone cognitively to essentialist ideas, even if they don't make sense. So the best way I can explain this, and I apologize to all these people if I'm butchering their ideas, but the way that I've come to take it in and understand it is that once you've used the label, it's sort of hard to put it back in the box. And because people have a tendency to want to label, want to have some kind of idea, I am a schizophrenic. So I think the best you can do is try to keep talking about it, but I think it's hard. I think we make sense of our world through language. And so once you start to use words, it's tricky. It's tricky to kind of undo it, but I don't know any other way to do it than to talk about it and to realize that you're working within a culture and people are already coming in with a lot of ideas about these things. There's a lot in our culture. This world, this era of the broken brain goes back to the 80s. You probably weren't even born then. So you grew up in an era where this was part of the lexicon, part of the way that we think about human experience. And that's a tough thing to undo.
So with this new understanding and new knowledge, I can imagine you going to work on Monday and feeling really resentful, feeling like you're swimming against a current because now the whole field of psychiatry is thinking one way and you're just painfully aware that they're operating within these heuristics that are not inroads to deeper truth, but maybe getting people bogged down and even hurting patients. But instead of being resentful, you've gone the other way with that, and I think you've done something of a collaboration with your colleagues and an acknowledgement of your field for what it is and sort of meeting psychiatry where it is. Will you talk about what you and your colleagues do and have been doing to sort of reconcile for some of the mistakes that you find in modern psychiatry?
Yeah, thank you. So in Anatomy of an Epidemic, at the end of the book, Robert Whitaker talked about what can you do if you don't want to be as reliant on medications because you're worried about long-term outcomes. Yeah. And that was a big question for me because I really didn't know any other way to work. And he mentions two ideas, two ways of working that had been researched. One is soteria and one was open dialogue. So I began, and all this reading that I was doing was I began to learn about both of those. I had never heard of them before. And open dialogue was developed in northern Finland, and it evolved out of something, and it's more what I prefer to use, although it's not as great a name and people haven't heard of it as much, called need-adapted treatment or need-adapted approaches. And this evolved in the 80s in Finland when they were trying, like we were trying, to empty their long-term asylum type hospitals. And it came out of this idea. It was a lot of different influences. One idea was that there's a lot of different ways about thinking about this thing we call schizophrenia. So there's biological hypotheses, social hypotheses, psychological hypotheses. And there was family therapy was a bigger thing at the time, and they were interested in that. And they all come with their particular treatment approach. And some treatments seem to work for some people. It's very hard to know which is which. So they decided that they would bring the person at the center of concern and that person's social network, often the family, in and say that. So that's already a little different, because it's different from the biological psychiatrist going and saying it's your brain and the social psychiatrist saying it's this. So they said that they had this conversation, and they found that conversation ended up being like real helpful, much more helpful than they expected. That's how they described it. There's a book written about this. So then they began to just study the nature of those kinds of meetings. So the need-adapted idea is that they're modeling treatment based on the needs of the system, the needs of the individual. Rather than coming in as an expert and saying, I do my evaluation, I'm going to tell you what's wrong. So embedded in it is this less hierarchical, more democratic way of working. So they were influenced by other things. There was another psychiatrist in northern Norway, Tom Anderson, who was developing something called reflecting therapies. And he was influenced by different family therapies at the time. There was Milan systemic family therapy. And in that model, you would have a family meeting and with a therapist, and then another therapist or two behind a one-way mirror. They would be like hooked up, and the therapist in the room with the family would get like suggestions through a headset. And at some point in both areas, they were all exploring these ideas. They realized like this didn't feel right. The family didn't really like it. And they came out behind the mirror and started to have those conversations with the person. So in front of the person, rather than through the headphones say, I'm wondering this, or I wonder about that. And then they turn to the family and say, what do you think about that? That's the reflection was what the therapist, the conversation they would have, and then they'd talk to the family. And they found in both of these regions that this was much more palatable to people, and they started working together. And in northern Finland, around this town, Tornio, Finland, they began to study this and do this work, and it evolved through their experiences, and they called it open dialogue. Now, another thing that happened is that around the late 80s, it wasn't taken as a certainty that with psychosis, with a first episode psychosis, that you needed to start the drugs as soon as possible and continue them indefinitely. That was actually a hypothesis that got raised in the early 90s. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when that paper came out. It was considered a question, and they did this big research study, and in 3 areas, they decided to hold off on using antipsychotic drugs. And Tornio was one of those areas. And they kept doing that. That's how their practice evolved. And they've done a series of outcome studies. And these studies have some limitations, but what they showed is that their outcomes were very, very good, much better than what we're seeing in the West. And, at 5 years on average, only 30% have ever been on an antipsychotic, only 19% are on them at 5 years, and yet they have a rate of something like 19% of people are on disability. It's completely the opposite about what happens in the West. So he wrote about that. That was kind of astonishing. And so I began to look into that, and just through a remarkably fortuitous series of events, was able to get training. Then there have been a whole group of colleagues in Vermont. We've been supported by the Department of Mental Health, and we've actually created in Vermont our own iteration of this kind of work that we call collaborative network approach. And we're beginning to do our own trainings. We're growing this at Howard. I mean, this is very much a work in progress, but it has influenced me. I mean, I just, in the past couple of weeks have heard about young people who are struggling, and the question, how you start treatment in Tornio is, who else would be helpful to understanding the problem? So from the very beginning, you take this network approach. And when you meet with someone, the questions are, what's the history of the problem? And you hear everybody's point of view, what everybody thinks about this, and what would be a good use of this time today. That's how you work. So it's very different from me going in and asking my set of questions so that I can put you in the box that I have. And it's been remarkable work. I mean, for me right now, it feels like the most meaningful way of working. It's not a miracle. It's not a panacea, but to me, it just feels more humane. And another part about it is I talked about less hierarchical. So I don't give up my medical training. It's just a perspective. It's not the perspective with capital T. It's a perspective that sits with other perspectives. That feels more natural to me. The other thing that you practice with humility, well, that feels very natural to me. I mean, you've said a lot of nice things about me, but honestly, I feel like I need to guard against not being humble. I get a lot of privilege in the world, right, being a doctor, and I think that, to me, the only honest way to work as a psychiatrist is to lead with humility. It feels to me that there's more that I don't know than I do know. And so uncertainty is another principle. We don't know. So you walk in, rather than walking in saying, we're going to head towards a label, even if, you don't believe it. I don't want to head towards a label. I want to sit with the uncertainty. We don't know. We just don't always know how best to understand these problems. We don't always know what's going to be the best thing. And so you sit with that, and you believe that this network has some wisdom and knowledge, and you want to help them. We talked about agency, help them to draw on that, to draw on their strengths. So this is what we're evolving, and it's been a very exciting time. And to say for the record that I am very grateful to the support that there's a whole group of people that we've had certainly from Howard Center Department of Mental Health. We wouldn't be where we are without that support.
You were talking before about a philosophical concept. It's difficult to forget something completely once it has entered your lexicon. So for that reason, is it ever difficult when you're doing collaborative network sort of therapy? Is it difficult? I mean, do people come in and feeling like, even though they know what's about to happen, they still feel this sort of visceral sense that you're the psychiatrist and you're going to teach them something, or vice versa?
Well, the nice thing about it is you can talk about those ideas. Like, what were you hoping today? What did you think I would know? What do you think about what I know? What do you think about these ideas? There's a lot, and this comes from systemic family therapy, circular questions. Who thinks I know something? Who thinks I don't know something? Who, there certainly are times where someone in the room, I mean, I remember one experience where someone in the room really wanted me to give a certain label to another family member. And for a lot of reasons, and this was not, it was this person's way of thinking things would be resolved. And so I felt a lot of pressure on that. And, we were able to talk it through. I think a lot of us in the helping field want to fix, that's what we do. I mean, I think, I've thought a lot about this as a parent. Like, your kid is sad and you want to come up with a solution. And I learned from being a child and being a parent that sometimes what people don't want the fix that you want to offer. So I've learned a lot to ask permission to offer advice as opposed to offering advice. But yeah, I mean, it's, in a way, the things that people come in from the culture, the expectations, is just another thing to talk about. And so in that way, it gives a frame to have those conversations and not just bulldoze by them and assume everybody's kind of thinking in the same way. I don't really particularly introduce this. This is how, and I'm not, believe me, people that work with me, if they were sitting here today, might say, she's not really doing this. She talks too much. You can see how much I talk. No, you worry about that. I do come in, and where I work, I'm in a power role and a hierarchical role. And I don't believe that I embody this as well as I would like to. It's an aspirational kind of thing. But for me, it's just the way I introduce it. So I'm wondering who else might be helpful to this, or I have found it helpful to have another person in the room. This is something that I've learned over time. So I don't introduce it as, oh, it's this new thing we're doing. I will say to someone, I found it helpful to have other people in your network come in. It's really hard to get to know another person. So I offer the invitation, and I just try, a part of also the principles is transparency. So I just try to be transparent. Now, if it seems really confusing, I may then give more of an explanation. Or, I'm wondering if you want to know why I do it this way and other people do it differently. A lot of questions are like wondering. Yeah. I'm wondering, or what do you think? What do other people think? That's sort of the nature of dialogic practice. So I don't embody this all the time. I mean, I go to a lot of meetings, and it's very time consuming. So sometimes you just don't have the time. I'll tell you, polyphony is really hard. If you invite polyphony, honestly, then you need to take the time to hear all the voices. And so these meetings can be quite lengthy. And so there are times when I'm hierarchical and I say, this is what's going to be, but I do try as much as possible to bring it into the clinical work I do.
And on the other side of this coin, how do you and other clinicians keep from regressing into old bad habits, and how do you counteract them when you do?
Well, it's so interesting because, and I work with people with lived experience. I'll give a shout out to a really brilliant woman named Leslie Nelson, who is the head of our START team, which is a peer crisis team. And Leslie worked for one of the first need-adapted treatment implementations in the United States called Parachute New York City. And so she came in there as a person with lived experience, had a lot of training, and then worked entirely in that context for 5 years. So she's probably in Vermont, if not the country, one of the most skilled in this way of working. Plus she comes in with that peer perspective. Peers don't have to unlearn a lot of the things that professionals have, because I think it comes more naturally to come in a non-hierarchical way. What I find for myself, and I think a lot of us, is that we're having to undo things. And one of the things that's so interesting is undoing the tendency to interpret. So I left psychoanalytic work many, many years ago. And yet what I have learned is how embedded it is in me to interpret, to say for someone how I'm translating their experiences. And so I need to be really careful to not do that. So there's sort of simple things that you can do. So wondering, using a person's own language. So to not translate it, to not translate the language. So someone that I'm working with uses the word ordeal for this experience this person went through. So that's language that, can be used as opposed to my language. So it's by doing stuff like that, you get a little closer to not falling back to old habits. I mean, my biggest challenge is that I am an explainer. I think the writing for me has been really therapeutic, because a lot of times I go into writing to work out something I'm trying to make sense of, or a complicated paper, or different ideas. So it's been like an outlet. I'm sure if you were to talk to people that I work with, and certainly to my family, you would hear I still do way too much explaining and talking. There's certain things about your core nature that are very hard to change, but they're things that I try to pay attention to.
I like that you want to center as much as you can around your client, like use the same language that they're using to describe their experience. No matter who's talking, a clinician trying to make sense of another person's experience, or a client trying to explain his or her own experience, memory doesn't work like a tape recorder. So people are going to get some objective facts wrong about the sequence of events that happened in a story that they're telling. So insofar as that's true, the only person for whom the experience really matters is the client. So I enjoy that your intuition here is to make sure that you, as much as possible, are part of your client's world.
I think that truth is a pretty tricky concept. We all are constructing the world. We're all kind of in our own little delusional kind of world. And so the way we connect with each other is to find commonalities. So, if someone has an interpretation or a story that seems more idiosyncratic than others, that may get talked about, but we're not trying to take it from them, because that is what their experience has been. And it seems really important to validate that as opposed to pull it away. And I just hear it a lot. For a while I was having a hearing voices group, which technically wasn't. Hearing voices developed out of the Netherlands, and it was a way of people who are voice hearers to come together in a less medicalized way and to learn from each other. And it's another one of these ideas that I sort of fell into and learned about as I was doing all this exploring. So I wanted to offer that group at Howard, and I did for a while. And ideally it would have been a group run by voice hearers, but I never had someone who was able to step up. But it was a good space for me because I tried my best to not be Dr. Steingard in that room. I mean, not perfect by any means. And I tried not to talk and to make it the space for other people. It was remarkable and another humbling kinds of experience after many, many years of basically talking to voice hearers every day almost, just sitting in that space without an agenda. I learned a lot more about the experience of voice hearing than I had before. And that was kind of sobering, humbling. But I think what I heard for a lot of people is the disconnect and the isolation and living in a world that maybe other people, this is their world. These are relationships. These are like serious, intense relationships. And I think there's something to be said for helping people to just think about it. What is the nature of that relationship? Right. And among other things, what they do is maybe say, yeah, you're hearing voices. They're real. This is real to you. But I'm wondering if you're able to shift the relationship that you have with them so that maybe you can get some more peace, or maybe you won't be so bullied, or maybe you won't be so humiliated. Because one of the sad things about voice hearing is often they're quite negative. And it's almost as if people hear aloud their worst thoughts about themselves. So it's really can be quite horrible for people. But some people through this way of working have found a way to have a different kind of balance with them that gives them a little bit more peace.
This gets back to why I like your idea of centering things around the client, because I can imagine a psychiatrist trying to tell someone who hears voices that, no, they're not real. Let's figure out how to deprogram you from thinking those voices are real. But actually, if someone's hearing voices, there couldn't be anything possibly more real. So allowing them to have that experience and explain it and live through it, I imagine, is empowering and motivating.
I mean, one of the things, and I'm probably not going to be able to articulate this as clearly as I like, but one of the things that has troubled me is that we seem to live in an era of neuroscience kind of being the thing. You know, if you see something on an imaging study, that's the truth of it. I remember there was a really beautiful article written in, I think it was the New Republic, and it was about loneliness studies. And there's been a lot of interest on sort of loneliness and its negative health effects and all this kind of stuff. And there was something in it where they were talking about how loneliness has these negative impacts on people. And then they talked about neuroimaging studies that showed that there were differences in the people that were lonely versus people that aren't. And that was, it was a beautifully written article, but that was the point to say, so that proves it's true. Right. And see, this is, I think, a question we need to ask. Why does that make it more true than someone saying, I have pain from being lonely, or that, you know, we see this? I mean, I think that we're putting way too much money into this. I mean, this is where I get into trouble because any neuroimaging person, or people think I'm anti-science. I'm not anti-science. It's about resources, and I think we're putting a disproportionate amount of money into wanting to figure out how the brain works, and I think there's other things that we can do that are cheaper that I think can be helpful, and I don't think we need to necessarily know how the brain works. I mean, one funny story for my life is that my husband, I mentioned, he's a psychiatrist, was a psychiatrist, and is very interested in philosophy, and kind of pulled me into this. And a long time ago when we were residents, he took me to hear a talk by a very famous philosopher of the mind, Patricia Churchland. She's married to another well-known philosopher, and they have a kid. And one day at the breakfast table, the kid was young, and he said to them, what if the brain is more complicated than it is smart? Now, I don't have a very good memory. I've never forgotten this because I knew right then and there my brain is more complicated than it's smart. You know, I think we're going to have a problem, you know, and what I've seen over the course of my career, I remember a very brilliant young neurologist told me in the 80s I was getting interested in schizophrenia. And he said, we're going to have this figured out in the next 3 years. Like he was working on something. I still want to meet him again and say, what was it? I mean, what's happened to me and my, not sophisticated grasp of neuroscience is it's fascinating, but it's led to ever more complexity. And I think there's going to be a problem that we're not necessarily going to be able to translate it into a way that any of us can make sense of. So it's always going to be a kind of cartoonized, that's a word, version, like those little serotonin bubbles that we saw on TV. And so, I mean, that's a problem for the neuroscientists and the philosophers to work out. But meanwhile, there are things that I think we can be doing that don't involve all that technology that I think can be helpful. Helping people to eat better, helping people to figure out how to get outside and exercise. I'm very interested in habit formation. That's sort of a new thing. And I just don't think we're doing enough in that area that I think could improve the quality of people's lives and help them to feel better. And it's just sort of a big frustration for me.
You alluded to something earlier, and I want to bring it back into this context. Do you think that the reason, if insofar as you get pushback from other psychiatrists, do you think that the reason is having this sort of holistic outlook, these really practical common sense things that you can do with people, help their health, improve their, get them outside, their community, social, family connections? Do you think that undermines some sort of authority of a psychiatrist? A psychiatrist has an MD, and so does doing this sort of stuff put you at the level of like a social worker or psychologist?
I think it's complicated. So I know that some people think, in the story of the evolution of psychiatry, there's a pretty good book that just came out called Mind Fixers by Harvard historian of science, Anne Harrington. And she's written about this, like how did things evolve? And in some ways, people have argued that there are many factors going on. I think the 80s and 90s to me and that's when I started in psychiatry, so I observed this, a big shift in psychiatry, and it was a shift to the broken brain, a lot of promotion of new drugs, the drugs were really great, and this notion that we have now, and that to some extent it was the guild, because there were all these other people, other professional societies that were able to do essentially what psychiatrists needed to do. So why do you need a medical degree to do this? So they needed to distinguish themselves. And plus there's a lot of discrimination within medicine against psychiatry. It's not, it's kind of looked down on. I remember, I think part of why I became a psychiatrist is that I sort of have an outsider identity, and it was, I kind of liked being in the thing that everybody made fun of. Yeah. But, I think there was this tendency to legitimacy. But I think even more than that, I think medical education involves a lot of enculturation. The language you use, the way you talk, all this kind of stuff, that you get a lot of messages of needing to kind of conceptualize problems in a certain way, to be seen as smart, to be a good student, to be a good resident. And that continues in residency. So you get this like indoctrination, and I don't see it in an evil way. It's a systemic thing. And so the best residents, when I was a resident, I was in a program that was kind of like a kindergarten for the Psychoanalytic Institute. And I was rewarded because I seemed to have some facility for developing psychodynamic formulations. So I wanted to do that well. So I did it well. It took me a little bit of time and engagement with some more critical thinkers to sort of step outside and question it. But I think it's just a lot of different things that come in, and then now it's just embedded in our culture, I think, that this is how we think about these problems.
When you think about the field of psychiatry in the next 5, 10, 20 years, do you think it'll take a turn away from being neurocentric and medicine-centered to being more practical in sort of a similar way that psychiatry went at one point from Freudian psychoanalysis to something more deep and true? I guess that's just a long way of saying, are you optimistic about psychiatry in the future?
I'm going to approach it in a medical way, because although I think that psychiatry as a profession, I wish there was like a truth and reconciliation. I wish there was a more honest reckoning with it, and not to say people were bad, but mistakes were made by us, to tolerate that cognitive dissonance. I think that's important. And I just want to say, for the record, that I've gotten a fair amount of support from within my profession.
Yeah.
And I joined one organization, the American Association of Community Psychiatrists. I've been pretty open about my views. I mean, I'm just some small town psychiatrist in Burlington, so I'm not a big deal, but to the extent that I engage with people, I haven't hid it. And to the extent that they're interested, it's out there for them to see. And that group, I ran to be on their board, and I got elected to their board. And they have a journal that's published by Springer, the Community Mental Health Journal, and someone nominated me to become the new editor, and that just came out. I'm going to be the editor of this journal. That's a deeply flattering thing, but that's a peer-reviewed journal and going into it, I was very clear with both the organization, with Springer. This is who I am. These are my values. This is what I think the current editor's done a brilliant job, and I have a lot of respect for her, but I'm going to be editor, and I want to at least have the opportunity to bring my perspective, and here I am doing that. So I don't want to dump on my profession. There've been really remarkably kind and thoughtful people that I've gotten to know that I really appreciate, but still, I think there are problems. However, what I was going to say is goes beyond psychiatry, and I think that there's a problem in all of medicine. I really don't trust doctors very much, and I know that you're interested in the opioid problem, and that problem, it's a systemic problem, and it almost worries me that we're paying so much attention to the Sacklers and Purdue and now Mallinckrodt, and I believe me, I think they should be held accountable, but this is happening with devices. This is happening with histamine blockers that people take for heartburn. It's happening everywhere. It's happening with blood thinners, that you'll see on TV. If you're an old person, you watch TV, you see all the new drugs coming out. It's happening every day in this field. And I'm not optimistic because I don't see any fundamental reckoning with this. And it's worrisome.
I don't know maybe the best way to word this, but let me give it a shot. Do you ever feel like when you go to work that you have to stay silent, that you have to keep your views and sort of big thinking about psychiatry to yourself, lest you be seen as disagreeable or some sort of anti-psychiatry crusader?
I've been incredibly fortunate, and one idea that I was introduced to in my critical social science exploration is this concept of social capital. And when I'm an outspoken person, so and I want to be transparent, and I want to be the same person in every setting. So, I can feel a pull that if I'm in with a crowd that leans a little bit more anti-psychiatry, that maybe I could sort of have those more negative views. But then when I'm with a bunch of psychiatrists, and I live in a psychiatric world, I have a lot of psychiatrists in my family who I love, and I want to be the same person. I want to be integrity. So I really try to do that. And so, but I do try to adhere to that. Certainly starting in the 90s, when I was concerned about these drug reps coming in, I was pretty outspoken about that, did a lot of reading, tried to demonstrate to people why this was a problem. And as I said, the first thing I did when I had authority at Howard Center was to ban drug reps and to do a lot of talking and explaining on why this was a problem. And I've always had full support from the agency on that. So this is something that I know now. There may be people, it's a big agency, and there may be people thinking she's a little off the deep end. I mean, I don't know what to say, but I do have to say I've had support. I mean, you talked about a conference. I think that was an enormous honor that was given to me by my agency to put me up there with those other people that were there who are way more well-known and accomplished writers than I am. So that to me meant awful lot to me, and I think they didn't need to do that, and they chose to do it. I mean, I've given a lot of talks at Howard. I've tried to explain to people why I'm shifting in my way of drugs, because we are a collective, and if I have people working in a residence with people who are struggling, and they're going to be the ones dealing with some difficult behaviors, they need to understand why I'm doing this. We need to be partners. So I think when I sort of took this latest turn, I had already been at Howard now quite a while, and I'm pretty old, and I was already old then. So I had been in Vermont for a while, and I think people knew me as, you know, I think people might say I'm hardworking, that I'm conscientious, that I had built up that capital so that I don't know what it would have been like if I was a 30-year-old psychiatrist coming in here and saying some things that seemed kind of different. I mean, and I do try to be respectful of people. I mean, I have strong opinions, and I try my best to say them in a respectful way and to just respect how hard people are working. But I've been extremely lucky. I mean, it's kind of shocking, but I try to never lose sight of just my whole life. You know, it'll choke me up to say, like, you know, my grandparents sacrificed a lot. So you know, let me just take a minute. You know, I appreciate all the, like, privileges that I've been given, you know, and you know, I just feel like I need to use that in a conscientious way. I mean, I try, you know, and I work with people who have so little, and I have so much, and, you know, it touches me.
Well, Sandy, this conversation has been so valuable to me, and I really mean it. And I know I haven't really had the language necessary to articulate fully a lot of the concepts that we're talking about and the ways you want to talk about them. So thank you so much for engaging me and really helping me and leading me through it.
Well, it's been so much fun to meet you, and we've come from these different directions, and I think we both have this feeling of, like, having these similar ideas. And, you know, we were talking about connection and how much connection matters. So, yeah, I think I have a similar feeling, and it's been really fun to talk to you.
Well, thank you so much. It has been a lot of fun, and enough fun that I completely neglected to mention your book, Critical Psychiatry. We've been touching on a lot of concepts from it today, but is there anything I've missed so far? Any concepts that are sort of glaring that people should understand if they want to form a coherent vision of your conceptualization of psychiatry and what critical psychiatry is?
I do want to give props to the other contributors. I've mentioned Joanna Moncrief, who wrote, you know, chapters with me and on her own, and a lot on this idea of the drug versus disease-centered approach. We have a chapter on conflicts of interest. There's a chapter on the development of DSM that gets into this idea of conceptual competence and sort of philosophical ideas and how to think about the DSM, which I think is quite novel. And it's a longer chapter, and I think it's worth the work. There's a chapter on deprescribing, which is sort of an idea about taking people off medications. We did address coercion, and that's controversial, but I thought any book that enters into the world of critical psychiatry needs to address that. Sure. And then I think there's a very interesting article on mad pride and neurodiversity and sort of the perspective of lived experience. So I had a chance to talk about my own ideas and where I think a drug-centered perspective and need-adapted treatment can be used to reform the field in a helpful way. So it's a slim book, but I feel pretty good about what we did, and I feel really grateful that the people who stepped up, I'm not saying all their names because I feel I will forget names, but it's critical psychiatry, controversies and clinical implications. It'd be great if people could get it into libraries because unfortunately, it's a little bit pricey. Springer writes textbooks. Yeah. I think they're meant for libraries. And if people are listening and they really want it, they should get in contact with me because I get some discounts and can help people out. But it'd be great to get it into libraries so people can read it.
So that's your book, Critical Psychiatry. People can get it on Amazon, the Kindle edition. They can rent it on Kindle. That's what I did at first. And how else can people access your work and find out more about you?
Well, all of my blogs are at Mad in America. The other thing I'll give a shout out to is that I'm the chair of the board of the Foundation for Excellence in Mental Health Care. And that's a foundation that was really formed after Anatomy of an Epidemic came out from some people that wanted to be able to try to fund some ideas that were being ignored. And so I've been part of them for quite a while now. Now I'm their chair. I think that organization is probably the largest funder of any kind of open dialogue implementation in the United States. They've funded hearing voices networks and training for hearing voices. So that's another link that I'd like to put on here because we're still moving ahead and going strong. And I did mention the American Association of Community Psychiatrists, which I feel really privileged to have taken me in. And I've met psychiatrists who I think are doing fabulous work. And I just don't want to lose sight of that because people working in the streets, working with people that are homeless, working in correction centers, really kind of trying to practice in a humane, respectful way. And so I want to give them props too.
Great. I'll link to all those things in the show notes. Sandy, thank you so much for coming and doing this in person today. Thanks for donating all of your time and your wisdom. And I thank you not only on behalf of myself, but for all of our listeners who I think are going to get a treat when they listen to this episode.
Thank you for having me.